Tonight, as the world outside your window gently drifts into sleep, let's step softly, ever so softly, into the distant past, not just far away in miles, but in centuries. Imagine it's China, not the China of bullet trains and glowing cities, but a quieter, dustier China. The one where cranes flew low across the misty rice paddies and court musicians played sleepy melodies on bamboo flutes that echoed off the stone walls of ancient palaces. You're not in Beijing, not yet. You're in the folds of the Tang dynasty, or to be precise, just before it even begins. The silk is coarse. The air is heavy with incense. The palace gardens are still dreaming. And inside one room, just one small room, a baby girl is about to be born. Her name will be Wu Zhao. But don't worry about that just yet. She won't be famous for quite some time. She's still wrapped in soft linen, her tiny fists closed, as if already holding secrets. And secrets, it turns out, she will collect for a lifetime. So, if you're lying in bed, adjusting your pillow, tucking one hand under your cheek, perfect. This story is not here to rush you. It will unfold like a painted scroll, slowly unrolling across time. In this tale, no battle scenes roar. No emperors shout commands on horseback. Instead, you'll hear the shuffling of silk shoes down stone corridors, the slow exhale of a calligraphy brush across parchment, and the heartbeat of a woman who changed an empire without ever raising her voice. Tonight, we follow Empress Wu Zetian, the only woman in Chinese history to rule as emperor in her own right. But don't expect drama and dragons. No, this is her story, as told by moonlight, gentle, ambient, and just a bit dusty with time. A tale made for sighing into your sheets, not gripping the edge of your mattress. Because Wu Zetian didn't just seize power. She arrived quietly, like a breeze in a sleeping chamber. She didn't scream her way into history, she whispered. And somehow, the world listened. So let your thoughts float away. Let the cool of history wrap around your shoulders like an old silk robe. You're in safe company here. No harsh light, no judgment, no hurry. Just a quiet legend. A long life, and many, many nights. Are you ready? Then breathe in slowly and let the story begin. By the time Wu Zhao was old enough to walk without help, the halls of her family home already echoed with the careful footsteps of a girl unlike the others. She was born not into royalty, but into privilege. Her father, Wu Shihuo, was a respected official during the fading years of the Sui dynasty and early rise of the Tang. And her mother came from a noble family with cultural clout. Their household was large, filled with the gentle rustling of silks, the scent of ink and pine from the family's calligraphy room, and the low murmur of Confucian lessons offered not just to the sons, but surprisingly to the daughters too. Wu Zhao, clever and still sticky with childhood mischief, listened with a focus beyond her years. She learned early that the world was divided not always fairly, and that women were expected to walk softly, speak less, and observe from the side. But no one told her that she had to agree. When others looked down, she looked forward. When other girls were praised for needlework, she asked questions about law, history, and the lives of previous emperors. Her tutors were puzzled, then impressed, then cautiously quiet. There was something watchful in her, not rebellious in the loud, break-the-rules sense, but a quiet, relentless curiosity that didn't retreat. Education for girls, even in noble families, was often ornamental. Poetry, perhaps, Music, of course, a refined way to pour tea. Wu Jiao mastered these quickly, but treated them like steps on a staircase rather than the destination. She recited poems with such clarity that the servants would pause behind doors to listen. She debated Confucian passages with the ease of a court scholar. And when no one was looking, she practiced the art of persuasion, softening her voice to seem harmless, then sharpening it to win small family arguments. She was, in many ways, the perfect daughter, obedient when necessary, brilliant when allowed. But it was her father who noticed the quiet strength beneath her gentle exterior. He once told a guest that his daughter had the eyes of a hawk beneath the lashes of a lamb. A strange compliment, perhaps, but a true one. Her gaze lingered longer than a child's usually would. She didn't just hear stories, she studied them. As she grew, so did the world around her. The Tang dynasty had emerged from the chaos of the Sui with new ambition. Chang'an, the imperial capital, glittered with ceremonial processions and philosophical debates. Monks carried Buddhist scriptures alongside traders bearing silks and spices. Officials plotted over tea. Artists shaped the world through scrolls and brushstrokes. And in this blooming empire, somewhere between the shadows of tradition and the lamps of progress, opportunity stirred. At 13, Wu Jiao's life shifted forever. It was said that Emperor Taizong of Tang, the great founder's son and ruler of an ever-expanding empire, was seeking fresh beauty and intellect among the daughters of noble families. A calling that blended politics with presentation. Some families hesitated. To send a daughter to the imperial harem was to lose her to the court, to intrigue, to a fate wrapped in red silk and duty. But Wu Jiao's parents didn't hesitate. They didn't see it as a surrender. They saw it as possibility. When Wu Jiao arrived at the palace, the grandeur overwhelmed even her well-prepared senses. Towering red pillars, carved stone dragons curling along staircases, musicians in gold-threaded robes practicing in shaded courtyards, the clinking of jade earrings and quiet, watchful laughter of dozens of other young women. All of them hopeful, all of them aware that favor from the emperor meant safety, wealth, and influence for them and their families. But Wu Jiao didn't just hope. She observed. Life in the harem was slow, but sharp-edged. A court within a court, ruled by invisible hierarchies and ancient etiquette. The women were trained to please, to entertain, to recite verses at the emperor's command. Wu Jiao joined as a lower-ranking concubine, far from the emperor's inner circle. Her days were filled with rituals, learning the correct angle to bow, the approved words of greeting, the ways of wearing sleeves like punctuation marks in a silent conversation. Yet she was not lost in the crowd. Even here, among hundreds, she distinguished herself not with beauty, though she had it, but with presence. She listened closely during poetry readings. She asked thoughtful questions during Buddhist lectures. She mastered the palace's labyrinthine rules with unerring memory. And more importantly, she waited. Because favor was not always granted to the loudest voice. It was often given to the one who remained unforgettable. Emperor Taizong noticed her eventually, not in a dramatic instant, but in the slow accumulation of her quiet brilliance. She served him tea with precision. She answered his philosophical musings with insight. She comforted his dogs when they limped after the hunt. She became a presence in his library, not his bedchamber, a distinction that oddly worked in her favor. Others competed for his affection through beauty. Wu Jiao offered peace, intelligence, and the rare ability to speak without overstepping. He gave her a name, Mainyang, meaning charming lady. A name not only of beauty, but of subtle influence. She wasn't just decorative, she was welcome. Still, when Emperor Taizong fell ill and died in the year 649, Wu Zhao's future dimmed. By custom, his concubines were to retire from courtly life, most commonly to Buddhist convents. Women who once bathed in perfume and silk were now expected to shave their heads and retreat into silence. Wu Zhao, barely in her 20s, was sent to Ganye Temple. A palace turned place of prayer. A girl turned ghost. But if anyone thought she had been erased, they misunderstood entirely. In the hush of temple life, as chants echoed through stone corridors and incense masked the smell of damp earth, Wu Zhao plotted her return. Her story was not over. It was only beginning. The Ganye Temple was quiet, but never truly still. Each morning began with the echo of gongs, the smell of damp stone, and the hush of murmured prayers. Wu Zhao, like the other former concubines, now wore the robes of a Buddhist nun, plain, coarse, and colorless. Her head was shaved, her status erased, and her future seemingly locked behind temple gates. But if she mourned the loss of court life, she never let it show. Instead, she watched. The temple was not only a place of worship, it was a crossroads. Courtiers came seeking blessings. Noble women visited in search of peace or gossip or both. Monks carried messages. Eunuchs delivered offerings. And news, like rain through cracked tiles, always found its way in. Wu Zhao sat through rituals, eyes lowered. But her mind raced through the shifting tides of politics outside. She knew one fact intimately. Emperor Taizong was gone, and in his place sat his ninth son, Li Ji, now known as Emperor Gaozong. Wu Zhao had met him once, long ago, in the hushed twilight of the court. He was gentle, quiet, and strangely drawn to her calm intelligence. She had caught his glance more than once, and remembered it. Now, in the stillness of the temple, she let that memory warm her, like a coal held close. She had heard that Empress Wang, Gaozong's wife, felt insecure. That consort Xiao was gaining favor. That the emperor, shy and often sick, was caught between two women and two worlds. The court, in short, was restless. And Wu Zhao had once known how to move in restlessness. It was Empress Wang who brought her back. The Empress, perhaps trying to weaken her rival Xiao, convinced Gaozong to allow the former concubine to return from the temple. A peculiar request. Why restore a woman who had served the previous emperor? But Wang assumed Wu Zhao would be harmless, a decorative rival to distract from more pressing threats. She had no idea what she had unleashed. Wu Zhao returned not as a girl, but as a woman who had studied silence like a language. She entered the palace again, wearing modest clothes, her head covered, her eyes soft. She bowed lower than expected, spoke less than required, and offered no hint of ambition. It was perfect camouflage. Gaozong remembered her instantly. Their old connection, subtle and suspended, rekindled easily. She listened when others pressed him. She soothed when others demanded, and he, uncertain in his role as emperor and often in poor health, leaned toward her the way a reed bends toward still water. She did not rush. She did not compete. She became inevitable. It wasn't long before he made her a concubine again, but this time with far more intimacy and trust. Her chambers filled with incense and whispered strategies. Her influence grew, not through confrontation, but through calm accumulation. She bore him children. She offered insight on state matters. She advised. She comforted. She endured. Meanwhile, Empress Wang and consort Xiao saw their positions eroding grain by grain. Wu Zhao's presence was like a quiet tide, not loud, but unstoppable. Where Wang was noble, Wu was understanding. Where Xiao was beautiful, Wu was wise. And in a court ruled as much by perception as policy, perception began to tilt. But Wu Zhao did not rely only on charm. She built alliances with eunuchs, those invisible gears of palace life. She rewarded loyalty. She remembered names. She watched who smiled too quickly and who bowed too late. And when the time came to act, she did so without hesitation. The turning point was brutal, and history still debates its exact details. But the story, as told for centuries, is this. Wu Zhao accused Empress Wang and consort Xiao of poisoning her infant daughter. The child had died under mysterious circumstances, and Wu claimed that jealousy drove the other women to murder. The court was shocked. An investigation was launched. And somehow, despite the Empress's protests, Wu Zhao's version prevailed. Empress Wang and consort Xiao were stripped of their titles, imprisoned, and eventually executed. Their downfall was swift, bloody, final, and just like that, Wu Zhao was named Empress. It was unprecedented. She, a former concubine of one emperor and none in exile, had now become the official wife of another, the highest-ranking woman in the land, and not just in title, but in power. From this new height, she did not pause. She reshaped the inner court. She promoted the capable over the noble. She encouraged scholars who valued Buddhism over rigid Confucianism. She studied state documents, learned law, and placed her allies in key positions. Gao Zong, often unwell, came to rely on her more and more, not just as consort, but as co-ruler in all but name. Palace whispers now spoke of two sages ruling side by side. Behind the palace walls, however, others whispered darker things, that she was manipulative, ruthless, power-hungry, that a woman's place was not on the throne, even beside a man. But Wu Zhao did not shout over her critics. She outlived them, she outmaneuvered them, and she remembered everything. Outside the palace, the empire churned. Rebellions flared. Officials plotted. The sickly emperor leaned on her judgment more heavily than ever. And in private meetings, ministers found themselves staring not at the emperor, but into the eyes of Empress Wu. Eyes that had once been called gentle. Eyes that now saw everything. By the time Wu Zhao settled into her new role as Empress, the palace had already begun to shift its weight in her direction. The routines of court life continued: the morning audiences, the memoranda on bamboo slips, the rustle of embroidered robes moving through shadowed halls, but beneath it all, a new rhythm pulsed, one where her voice, though soft, now shaped the tone of an empire. She did not govern openly, not yet. Gao Zong still held the throne, though more in name than in energy. His health declined steadily. Headaches, vertigo, fatigue. The court physicians diagnosed him with ailments of the liver, of the blood, of the spirit. Remedies were tried, herbs boiled, prayers offered, but nothing restored him fully. Through it all, Wu Zhao remained close. She spoke for him in meetings when he was too weak. She read through reports when his eyes could not focus. She signed her name when his hand trembled. At first, no one objected. She was, after all, the Empress, dutiful, attentive, intelligent. But over time, some ministers noticed that even when the emperor recovered briefly, Wu Zhao continued to hold the pen, continued to sit behind the curtain during audiences, listening, correcting, guiding. The court had never seen anything like it. China had known powerful women before empresses, dowagers, consorts who pulled strings behind silk screens. But Wu Zhao was not pulling strings. She was building scaffolding. Quietly but firmly, she was training the court to look to her for direction. She met with ministers in private. She reviewed military orders. She promoted officials who favored reform and removed those who whispered too loudly in opposition. She was not cruel, but she was not forgetful either. And while she ruled through Gaozong, she raised her sons with care. The heir apparent was watched closely. Other sons were groomed, guided, and when necessary, controlled. She knew that dynasty was both a legacy and a battlefield. She did not intend to lose either. It was during this time that her image began to shift in public perception. Official court painters, once limited to stylized and demure portrayals, began to depict her in deeper hues with clearer lines. Her eyebrows were not faint curves of gentleness, but arch symbols of authority. Her gowns bore the golden embroidery once reserved for the emperor alone. She still walked behind the throne, but more and more, people noticed that the throne leaned toward her. Outside the palace, she became a subject of rumor and awe. Farmers spoke of the Empress, who read court reports by moonlight. Merchants whispered tales of how she once memorized troop movements better than her generals. Monks praised her support of Buddhist temples, which bloomed under imperial patronage like lotus flowers after rain. Confucian scholars, however, grumbled. They saw in her rise a dangerous precedent, a woman stepping beyond her station, disturbing the order of heaven and earth. But the heavens did not seem disturbed. Harvests were good, trade routes stable. The empire grew. And Wu Zhao, now in her 40s, only grew more sure-footed. Gaozong's health continued to falter. He spent long days in his chambers, his ministers receiving instructions secondhand. At some point, no one could mark exactly when the Empress began issuing edicts in her own name. First, as a temporary measure, then as routine, then simply as rule. She established a secret police force quietly, effectively. Their purpose was not to terrify, but to inform. She knew the value of knowledge, who plotted, who resisted, who smiled too quickly. Every whisper reached her ears eventually, and she listened without flinching. It was around this time that people stopped calling her a consort who ruled behind a curtain. They began calling her the Second Emperor. Gaozong died in 683. The court, stunned and uncertain, looked to the heir for guidance. But the heir was young, inexperienced, and surrounded by men who expected to reclaim their own power now that the Empress was widowed. Surely, they thought, Wu Zhao would retire, become Empress Dowager. Step aside, as tradition dictated. She did not. Instead, she stepped forward. She placed her son on the throne briefly, but within months, she declared him unfit to rule, removed him, installed another, and when that one also proved inconvenient, she removed him too. The court, tangled in tradition and fear, had no precedent for what was happening. Ministers wrote letters in protest. She burned them. Monks warned of divine wrath. She commissioned more statues of the Buddha. Scholars invoked the mandate of heaven. She rewrote the mandate. In 690, she made it official. Wu Zhao, now Empress Dowager in name, declared herself emperor in fact. She took the throne not beside a man, but in her own right. She renamed the dynasty from Tang to Zhou. The empire had a new sovereign, and she was a woman. It was an earthquake felt across the world. Never before had a woman sat openly on the dragon throne of China. She wore the imperial robe, accepted the 9 bestowments, and received the officials' bows, not as mother of the ruler, but as ruler herself. She did not rule as a man. She ruled as Wu Zetian. The opposition was sharp and often silenced. Some officials disappeared. Others recanted their objections. Still others learned to speak carefully, using the correct title. She did not demand love, only obedience. And in return, she offered a steady hand. Roads were repaired. Tax systems adjusted. The bureaucracy, ever unwieldy, was trimmed and realigned. She issued exams for civil service posts, opening doors for scholars outside the noble families. She gave voice to new regions, promoted those with talent rather than lineage. And throughout it all, she made sure the imperial records reflected her legitimacy not as a temporary ruler, but as one chosen by the heavens. Temples now housed images of her beside the Buddha. Poets wrote verses comparing her justice to the autumn moon. Her name, once whispered, was now engraved in stone. She was no longer a shadow. She was the sun. The throne room of Wu Zetian's reign was unlike any that had come before. Not just because it was occupied by a woman, though that in itself would have rattled the bones of Confucian sages, but because she infused it with a vision wholly her own. The court, once rigid and predictable, became a stage for new voices, new ideas, and the slow, meticulous unfolding of a ruler who knew how to wait, how to watch, and how to strike without warning. She understood presentation as power. Portraits of her depicted a serene face framed by cascading black hair, dressed in embroidered robes of golden phoenixes, the mythical creature long associated with empresses, but now worn as her emblem of sovereignty. Where dragons had once signified rule, Wu Zetian elevated the phoenix, not as consort to power, but as power itself. The symbolism was clear to all who entered her presence. At morning audiences, ministers bowed deeper. Her voice, calm and steady, gave rulings with measured finality. She listened long, asked short questions, and made decisions swiftly. Unlike previous rulers, who were prone to bursts of anger or favoritism, Wu Zetian operated like a scale silent, always weighing. She rewarded competence, punished deceit, and kept everyone guessing who, exactly, held her confidence. Still, she was not without enemies. Even from her earliest days on the throne, pockets of resistance remained. Noble families resented the rise of scholars from lesser backgrounds. Conservative officials bristled at the memory of her swift rise, still murmuring that the removal of her sons had been unnatural. Others simply could not accept a woman's authority, no matter how just, no matter how successful. She knew this, and she did not forgive easily. The secret police expanded. Their reports came daily, scrolls filled with quiet betrayals, vague suspicions, names of those who hesitated before bowing or offered careless words over tea. Some were exiled, others executed. But more often, she simply let the accused know they were being watched. That alone was usually enough. Yet even in this, she was not monstrous. She allowed redemption. She rewarded loyalty, even if hard-won. Those who proved useful found themselves elevated faster than tradition would ever allow. Eunuchs became powerful advisors. Women in the palace found new roles as intermediaries and messengers. Her court began to mirror her logic, not who you were, but what you could do. And Wu Zetian could do much. She personally reviewed civil service examinations, sometimes offering commentary in her own hand. She invited Buddhist scholars to court debates and challenged their interpretations. She sent emissaries to the edges of the empire to build roads, bridges, and temples in her name, not out of vanity, but out of a deep understanding that the legitimacy of power is rooted in its presence. Under her rule, the empire expanded its reach. Borders were fortified, trade flourished, and agriculture improved through new policies that redistributed idle land. Famine, always a threat in China's vast interior, was kept at bay through organized granary systems. She had no tolerance for waste or incompetence. Governors who failed were replaced without fanfare. But if the empire grew stronger, the court became more cautious. Fear and admiration mingled in every glance. Her ministers learned to speak in careful tones. Every gesture mattered. A slow blink, a pause too long before answering. Zetian noticed it all. She had once survived the court as a concubine. She now ruled it as emperor, but never forgot the games played in its shadowed corners. And she played better than anyone. Her use of Buddhism as a tool of legitimacy reached new heights. Temples declared her the incarnation of Maitreya, the future Buddha, who would bring a golden age. Sculptures were commissioned, some carved directly into mountainsides, depicting her features fused with divine serenity. These were not idle decorations. They were statements, monuments of stone and faith that proclaimed her right to rule not only by law, but by cosmic design. Meanwhile, she reshaped the very language of empire. She had new characters created to represent her name, symbols that denoted light, heaven, and harmony. It was a subtle way of placing herself deeper into the fabric of China's written memory. Histories could be revised, monuments could be toppled, but written language, embedded in bureaucracy, in poetry, in law, was harder to erase. Of course, not all accepted these changes with gratitude. The Confucian elite seethed quietly. They accused her of vanity, of overreach, of twisting tradition to suit her ambition. But what they called vanity, she called vision. What they saw as audacity, she saw as survival. And in the grand chessboard of empire, she continued to checkmate her opponents before they even realized the game had begun. Still, she was not without loss. She had outlived many of her children, some to illness, others to suspicion, others perhaps to her own miscalculated instincts. The role of mother and ruler did not always harmonize. Her decisions were not always kind, but she believed they were necessary. She bore the grief of her choices alone, quietly, without spectacle. Even as age crept in, and her steps slowed, and her hearing dulled, her presence remained formidable. Servants still lowered their eyes. Ministers still chose their words as if walking barefoot across a frozen lake. And Zetian, now in her 60s, still read court reports late into the night by lamplight, her silhouette framed in gold and ink. She had ruled through silence, through whispers, through intelligence sharper than any sword. She had turned exile into ascent, motherhood into strategy, and palace games into imperial doctrine. And still, she watched. Still, she ruled. Age in the imperial court was a curious thing. For most, it meant fading gently into ceremony, receiving titles of honor, retiring to quiet estates, becoming shadows that once held power. But for Zetian, age brought something different: consolidation. Her mind remained sharp, her memory vast, her instincts as precise as ever. If her legs ached or her vision dimmed, she did not complain. She simply adjusted, delegated more, listened longer, calculated deeper. In the autumn of her life, she ruled not with fire, but with gravity. There was, in those years, a new kind of silence around her. Not fear exactly, though that too, but reverence, laced with disbelief. She had defied every expectation, rewritten the very logic of rulership, and still she sat, daily, firmly, on the dragon throne. Her court was quieter now. Ministers knew better than to posture. Words were fewer. Eyes flicked downward more quickly. She had long since moved the capital back to Luoyang, transforming it into her seat of power. Temples blossomed across its skyline like stone prayers. Canals shimmered with traffic. Bronze bells marked the passage of time with clear, ringing discipline. Her palace there was both austere and immense, a space of order where she worked long hours and received only those whose presence was purposeful. But even an empress cannot outmaneuver time forever. Her body began to betray her. Not dramatically, not all at once, but in the gradual, persistent way that time works. A tremble in the hand, a missed word in an edict, an afternoon nap that stretched too long. She allowed fewer public appearances. She surrounded herself with favored attendants. 2 young brothers from the Zhang family, said to be charming, witty, and perhaps more familiar with her than propriety would allow. The court grumbled. Whispers flickered like shadows across corridors. Old allies grew uneasy. Her sons, once displaced, now returned in cautious arrangements, watched closely, waiting. They smiled, bowed, offered gifts. But Wu Zetian, who had raised each one, knew better than to trust gifts from men trained in courtly patience. Still, she ruled. She continued to hold audiences behind her curtain, hearing the concerns of generals, priests, farmers, and foreign emissaries. She heard of floods in the south, droughts in the west, trade disputes with the Khitan, scholars proposing reforms, monks requesting funds. Each concern, each voice passed through her. She responded with clarity. She remembered names, histories, family lineages, everything. And yet the cracks widened. Officials began to speak more boldly, questioning the influence of the Zhang brothers. Petitions were sent, carefully worded but edged with steel. Advisors urged her to rest more, to consider abdication. Even the eunuchs, once her most loyal instruments, began to shift in tone. A kind of stillness fell across the court, as if everyone had taken a deep breath and was waiting for her to exhale. She resisted. She had ruled too long, too precisely to let it go easily. But in her heart, she must have known the arc was descending. Even emperors, especially emperors, must obey the rhythm of endings. In the year 705, after more than half a century of navigating court life, and nearly 15 years as emperor in her own right, Wu Zetian stepped down. It was not ceremonial. It was not warm. She was ill, pressured, cornered by those who once bent their knees in loyalty. Her favored companions were dismissed. The throne returned to her son, Zhangzong, whom she had once removed for weakness. There was no parade, no poems, no final address to the court. She retired quietly to a secondary palace within Luoyang. Its gardens were wide and well tended. The servants moved softly. The air carried the scent of pine and old stone. Her days were quieter now, filled with long silences, the rustle of robes, the occasional visit from officials who dared not stay long. She no longer issued orders. She no longer sat beneath banners of power, but she watched. She always watched. It is said that in her final days, she spoke very little, that she stared long out the windows of her chamber, that she listened to the wind in the trees, that she kept a scroll near her bed, perhaps poetry, perhaps state records, no one knows. She died later that year. Her son, now emperor, planned an elaborate tomb and title in accordance with tradition. But in a final, unexpected move, the epitaph stone of her grave was left blank. No name, no title, no dates, just a smooth slab of stone, silent as the woman who once ruled the mightiest empire on earth. Historians have debated this ever since. Was it meant as shame, as punishment, as ambiguity? Or was it, perhaps, the final quiet brilliance of Wu Zetian herself, a woman who had been named everything and yet was never defined by any of it? Maybe she didn't need a title carved in stone. Her reign was etched in the empire's roads, its laws, its temples, its language. She had entered history through a side door and exited like mist, without apology, without confession, and entirely unforgettable. Though her physical life had ended, Wu Zetian's presence did not vanish from China so easily. In the days and years that followed her death, the empire continued to run, slowly returning to Tang traditions, carefully rewriting certain records, quietly removing her name from official prayers. And yet, she remained. Like ink seeped into parchment, her influence could not be scrubbed away without erasing half the page. Her blank epitaph stood as a monument to that paradox. On the face of it, silence. No words to remember her, no praises, no condemnations. But beneath that stone lay stories that would echo for centuries. It is rare for an empress to have ruled alone. Rarer still for her to have reshaped a civilization in her image and leave behind no summary. Perhaps it was intentional. Perhaps after decades of being named and renamed, concubine, consort, empress, dowager, emperor, Wu Zetian wished to die as she had lived, on her own terms, defying the structure that tried to define her. A woman whose story was always more than one title could contain. Her enemies wasted no time. Scribes, freed from her shadow, began to compose critiques. They accused her of cruelty, manipulation, vanity. They listed the deaths that occurred under her rule, the political maneuverings, the alleged corruption. They painted her as a cautionary tale. What happens when a woman reaches too far beyond her place? But history, much like Wu Zetian herself, has never been easy to pin down. For every accusation, there was an accomplishment. For every whispered rumor, a public achievement. The roads she had built still carried trade. The scholars she had promoted still served the empire. The exams she had institutionalized continued to shape governance for generations. The temples she had endowed still rang with bells, and those who criticized her often did so from within the very systems she had created. Ordinary people too remembered. Stories of the Empress who ruled like a man, but kept a woman's grace, traveled across villages and provinces. Poets, centuries later, would write verses both admiring and haunted. Painters continued to depict her long after her image was declared improper. Even as the Tang dynasty reclaimed its masculine center, her figure remained at the edge of every ceremonial painting, just out of reach, but always present. Women, in particular, carried her memory in complex ways. To some, she was an inspiration, a symbol that intelligence and strength could shape the world, even in silence. To others, a reminder of the cost. Because Wu Zetian did not rule gently. Her life was filled with hard choices, and she rarely hesitated to choose survival over sentiment. But then again, neither did the men who came before her, and rarely were they asked to apologize. Modern historians continue to debate her legacy. Was she ruthless or merely effective? Was she an opportunist or a visionary? Did she love her sons, or did she love the empire more? The questions go on because Wu Zetian lived in contradiction. Graceful and unyielding, scholarly and political, spiritual and calculating. She exists now as both myth and woman. A figure of stone and silk, of firelight and parchment. Her story cannot be told in a single way because she never lived in a single dimension. In her lifetime, she rewrote laws, reversed traditions, and redefined what was possible. In death, she left behind not certainty, but wonder, and perhaps that is the most powerful legacy of all. So now, as you lie in your bed, your eyes growing heavier, your breath slower, remember this. The most extraordinary stories are not always the loudest. Sometimes they are written in whispers, shaped in patience, and left unfinished, not because they were incomplete, but because no ending could ever capture their fullness. And somewhere, behind the silence of a stone without words, Wu Zetian still watches, still waiting to be understood. In order to fully grasp the magnitude of Wu Zetian's rise, one must understand the China she inherited, sprawling, complex, and bound by tradition, like thread around a silk fan. The Tang dynasty, though golden in reputation, was not born in perfection. It was born in chaos. Rebellions, court assassinations, transitions of power under candlelight and steel. And even at its height, the empire trembled under the weight of its own systems. Noble clans clinging to privilege, regional governors acting as kings, scholars rigid in their adherence to the Confucian classics that elevated men and diminished women. Wu Zetian did not burn those books. She read them, and then she rewrote the margins. It began with the civil service. For centuries, the path to power was dominated by lineage. Families passed official titles to sons, nephews, and cousins like heirlooms. Examinations, when they existed, were performative, more ritual than merit-based. But under Wu's rule, the system began to shift. She expanded the examination process, introducing more rigorous standards, opening the doors, narrowly but significantly, to those of lower birth who could prove their worth in knowledge, not bloodline. This upset many. To the noble elite, it was a dilution of tradition. But to the empire's outer regions, to young scholars from modest homes, it was hope. Wu Zetian understood the power of loyalty earned, not inherited. She created a new class of officials who owed their success not to their fathers, but to her favor. These men, grateful and ambitious, helped solidify her rule, implement reforms, and spread her vision across the empire's vast provinces. She also knew the value of visibility. Statues of her likeness were placed in temples. Her edicts were engraved in stone. She ordered the construction of Buddhist pagodas and temples throughout China, not only acts of piety, but markers of her presence. Where others built fortresses, she built symbols. Buddhism, too, became a pillar of her rule. Unlike the rigid hierarchy of Confucianism, Buddhism offered a more fluid, spiritual justification for her power. She positioned herself not as a usurper, but as a chosen one, an enlightened ruler destined to restore harmony to a fractured world. Buddhist monks, grateful for her support, proclaimed her the reincarnation of Maitreya, the future Buddha. Scribes embedded these narratives into temple inscriptions, aligning the divine with the political. Her critics scoffed, but the people listened. Under her leadership, public works expanded. Roads were repaired, canals dredged, granaries stocked in anticipation of poor harvests. Wu Zetian oversaw census reforms to ensure fairer taxation, restructured regional governance to prevent corruption, and personally reviewed cases of injustice brought forth by the common people. In one remarkable edict, she invited citizens to post anonymous criticisms or petitions in public boxes, an act unthinkable under previous emperors. Of course, the gesture was not without limits. Dissent was tolerated, but not indulged. Those who crossed into open defiance, especially those from the old nobility, often found themselves removed, quietly or otherwise. But for many, especially those far from the capital, Wu Zetian's rule brought an era of rare stability. The northern borders held firm. Trade with Korea and Japan flourished. Merchants from the Silk Road brought goods, ideas, and rumors, all of which she monitored with interest. Inside the palace, her routines were meticulous. She rose before dawn, read petitions over tea, held court with a select circle of advisors, received diplomats with calculated warmth. When not working, she walked in her gardens, long, meditative paths surrounded by stone lions and weeping willows. She favored chrysanthemums, a flower that blooms in autumn and survives the first frost. A subtle symbol, endurance over beauty. As she aged into her 70s, few dared to speculate about succession. Her sons remained under her scrutiny, and though she had nominally restored the Tang dynasty name, she retained ultimate authority. She knew the danger of relaxing too soon. Power, she understood, was not a possession, it was a posture. The moment one leaned back, it was taken. And so she remained upright, watching, governing. She gave audiences reclining on a divan when standing became painful. She spoke slowly, but always precisely. And though the court whispered about her frailty, no one dared move without her approval. The Zhang brothers, though controversial, served as her hands and eyes, alerting her to discontent, soothing her loneliness, protecting her from isolation. Whether their companionship was political or personal remains debated. But to Wu Zetian, usefulness often blurred with affection. She understood that power demanded closeness, but also distance. She kept even her favorites at arm's length, never granting full trust. Her survival had depended on that from the very beginning. What must it have been like to be her in those years? To walk past tapestries embroidered with your own image, to hear courtiers recite poems praising your virtue, knowing that some had plotted against you the day before, to sip tea, knowing that every eye in the room watched how long you took to place the cup down, to rule not only as a woman, but as a woman who had never once pretended to be anyone but herself. It is said that toward the end, she dictated a final prayer, not to a god, but to the empire itself. It began, "I ruled because the world required it. I stepped forward because no one else would. I ask for neither forgiveness nor praise, only memory." And memory, it seems, has not let go. The memory of Wu Zetian became, in many ways, a mirror, one in which each generation of Chinese historians, poets, and rulers saw something different. She was villain, saint, revolutionary, tyrant. To some, she was the woman who had brought dishonor to the imperial lineage. To others, she was the brilliant exception that proved women could lead not just wisely, but better. But for all the labels, she remained stubbornly herself, inscrutable, complex, and unerasable. Her reign left no singular legacy. It left layers. In the decades following her death, Tang emperors returned to traditional structures. Her sons, restored to power, quietly dismantled some of the institutions she had supported. The secret police dissolved. Statues of her were removed from official temples. The dynasty returned to Confucian ideals, reinstating the male-dominated bureaucratic order she had challenged. But not everything reverted. The examination system she had expanded remained. The shift toward merit over birth continued to influence the bureaucracy. The Buddhist infrastructure she built, temples, schools, texts, remained vital for centuries. And the precedent she set, though politically uncomfortable, hovered over every court official's shoulder like incense smoke. Because once a woman had ruled, completely and unambiguously, that possibility could never again be denied. And it wasn't only China that remembered her. Across the sea in Japan, monks and scholars spoke of the Chinese Empress who had challenged heaven and prevailed. In Korea, legends filtered through merchants about a woman who read the stars and commanded armies. Even in later centuries, during foreign dynasties like the Mongol Yuan or the Manchu Qing, emperors measured their central authority against hers, whether in admiration or denial. Her story endured not because it was convenient, but because it refused to disappear. Centuries later, during the Song dynasty, when Neo-Confucianism tried to bury her memory under layers of male orthodoxy, she re-emerged in plays, shadow puppet operas, and whispered folk tales. The people did not forget. How could they? She had once ruled the land, not just with commands, but with imagery and structure. Her fingerprints were everywhere. Her blank epitaph stone became a site of quiet pilgrimage. Scholars stared at it, hoping to divine meaning. Poets wrote verses about its silence. One wrote, "No words can match her deeds, so the stone holds its tongue." Another simply carved his name beside hers, as if to say, "I was here too." Even now, her mausoleum in the Chenling complex remains partially sealed. Her tomb undisturbed for over 1,000 years. Some say it holds secret documents, statues, or even a final letter. Others believe it is empty, left as a riddle. Perhaps she wanted it that way, a quiet monument to a life so fully lived it could no longer be spoken. In modern times, Wu Zetian's image has undergone yet another transformation. To feminist scholars, she became a symbol of possibility, proof that intelligence and resilience can overcome centuries of custom. To playwrights and filmmakers, she is a compelling character, ambitious, mysterious, elegant, and terrifying. To school children in China today, her name still appears in textbooks, often with cautionary framing, but also with reluctant respect. It is not easy to teach someone who broke every rule without crumbling the system. In art, she appears again and again, painted as divine, beautiful, clever, cruel, or serene. Sometimes she is surrounded by flames, sometimes by lotus blossoms. Always she is central. Always her eyes seem to follow the viewer, as if waiting for you to understand her. Not just admire or fear her, but truly comprehend what she endured to sit on that throne. Because she endured much, from concubine to nun, from servant to sovereign, from mother to monarch, hers was a path of quiet warfare, strategic silences, patient calculations, decisive action cloaked in silk. She outlived emperors, buried enemies, and carved space for herself in a palace that never intended to let her stay. And perhaps that is why her story continues to soothe, even as it stirs. Because in the stillness of the night, when the world is soft and the past feels close, there is comfort in remembering someone who watched so carefully, listened so deeply, and moved so precisely that she changed the course of history without ever needing to shout. And if you're drifting now, eyes half closed, with the flicker of candlelight behind your eyelids and the hush of history in your ears, know this: you are not alone in this quiet. Wu Zetian is here too, still watching, still waiting, still whispering through the stone. In the rare moments when Wu Zetian allowed herself reflection, true, quiet reflection beyond ceremony and calculation, it is tempting to imagine her thinking not only of power, but of time. She had outlasted so many rivals, lovers, husbands, sons. Her youth had been spent dodging palace rumors and earning slivers of favor. Her middle years had been a balancing act between mercy and dominance, and her later reign as emperor had been a masterclass in resilience. But what did she think of herself beyond the titles? There are no journals, no diaries, no letters written in her own hand that have survived. What remains are edicts, inscriptions, and third-party chronicles, many of them skewed, crafted by men uncomfortable with what she represented. But if one reads between the lines, a picture forms, not only of a ruler, but of a woman who dared to believe she belonged in the rooms she was never supposed to enter, dared to raise her voice when silence was expected, dared to change the empire, not from its edges, but from its throne. She had tasted every texture of court life, silken and bitter, perfumed and bloody. She had nursed children and buried them. She had smiled at enemies while plotting their removal. She had trusted those who would later betray her and betrayed those who had once trusted her. Was it cruel? Or simply the only path available to someone born outside the realm of male inheritance? From the beginning, she had no illusions about the nature of imperial politics. The court was not a sanctuary, it was a crucible, a place where affection was currency and hesitation was a weakness to be punished. In that world, Wu Zetian did not survive by being cold. She survived by being precise. Where others used force, she used information. Where others used heritage, she used memory. And she remembered everything. Each gift, each slight, each shift in loyalty. She did not rage, she recorded. And in time, the scroll of her recollections became a ledger of power. But power, for Wu Zetian, was never an end in itself. It was the tool by which she shaped a world in her image. A world where capability meant more than bloodline. Where women could sit beside the fire of politics and not be burned, or at least not alone. It is easy to mythologize her, to paint her as either the dragon or the dove, the villainous or the visionary. But Wu Zetian was something far more unsettling, a real person, flawed, calculated, brilliant, capable of affection and exile in the same breath, capable of building a temple and ordering a beheading within the same week. And yet, people followed her, not only out of fear, but out of respect. Even those who despised her acknowledged her intellect. Ministers who resented her presence often complied with her orders. Generals obeyed her strategies. Scholars studied her decrees. She governed not through charisma, but through undeniable competence. When the Tang dynasty resumed after her death, it could never fully return to what it had been. She had stretched the boundaries too far. The roles had been recast. The palace, once a place of male legacy and female ornamentation, now held the echo of an emperor in a woman's voice. No matter how they tried to erase her, the rooms still remembered her footsteps. And the people remembered too. There's a tale, told more often in whispers than in scrolls, that long after her death, when young women were sent to court as concubines, they would pass by her tomb. Some would touch the stone. Others would bow quietly, not as a political act, but as a prayer, a hope that her strength might brush against them like a passing wind, that they too might survive what she survived, or dream what she had once dared to dream. Even now, in the hush between midnight and morning, when the air feels oldest and the sky most still, one can imagine her silhouette by lamplight, reading, deciding, unseen but utterly present. Her story, like all stories worth remembering, does not end with her final breath. It lingers, expands, adapts. It's not in stone. It's in the act of remembering. So breathe in, slowly. Let her memory settle like dust on silk. And know, what you've heard is not just history. It's a lullaby wrapped in scrolls and firelight. A tale meant not to shake you, but to still you. To guide you gently into dreams, where even emperors must someday sleep. Let us now step further back, not just from Zetian herself, but from the centuries surrounding her. Let the palace fade. Let the officials return to their scrolls. Let the lanterns dim. What remains when we peel away the rituals and titles, the dynastic struggles and stone monuments? What remains is the rhythm of a life, lived in quiet defiance of expectations. Zetian's story is often remembered for its boldest moments, her ascension to emperor, her accusations, her restructuring of power. But in the slower currents of her life, we find just as much meaning. In the gestures too small for historians to notice, in the choices made quietly, day after day, for decades. These are the moments we often miss when we look only for spectacle. Imagine her as a young girl, sitting in the family study while her father dictated correspondence. The sound of the brush against paper, the smell of ink, the weight of not being noticed. And yet, she watched. She learned. She did not resent the silence. She filled it. Later, as a concubine, she must have endured countless evenings of boredom and calculation. The competition for attention was not only about beauty, but timing, about knowing when to speak, when to remain silent, and when silence itself became the loudest answer. In a place designed to blur individuals into decor, she remained vivid. In the convent, there would have been another kind of silence, one not born of hierarchy, but ritual. The chants, the gongs, the breathing exercises. Perhaps for a time she found peace there, or perhaps she merely plotted. But either way, she listened. Over time, she mastered not only how to move through systems, but how to bend them gently toward her will, never at once, never through force, but through repetition, through presence, through the simple, stubborn act of staying. This perhaps is the most overlooked part of her strength, not just ambition or intelligence, but endurance. Her reign lasted longer than any female ruler in Chinese history. She lived to old age in a court where most fell by 40. She buried lovers, sons, enemies, and still she rose each morning and ruled. What does it mean to last in an empire ruled by season and flood, by ceremony and war? Lasting was not a passive state. It was a discipline. Zetian did not last because she clung to power. She lasted because she understood change, how to sense it, how to ride it like wind against a silk sail. She did not fear transition. She managed it. And though her methods were often criticized, harsh, pragmatic, emotionally distant, they worked. Her reign was not marked by ruin or civil collapse. It was marked by infrastructure, education, diplomacy. She was no destroyer. She was a builder who worked in shadow and stone. When she finally relinquished the throne, it was not because her mind failed. It was because her body did. Even then, she did not beg, plead, or vanish in disgrace. She stepped away with the same quiet control that had marked her entire life. And when the court tried to erase her, whitewashing her image, omitting her from official prayers, denouncing her political choices, they could not undo what she had built. Because history, like water, does not hold its shape, but it remembers, and it flows through every gap she created, every new path she cleared. Somewhere tonight, someone is still telling her story. Perhaps not in temples or textbooks, but in a whispered conversation between daughters, or in a poem written under a dim lamp, or in a moment of resolve when a woman decides to speak when silence is expected. That, too, is legacy. So as you lie back, the weight of the day slipping from your shoulders, the air cooling around you, let yourself remember that strength is not always loud. It is often slow, cumulative, invisible, and when history forgets to give it a name, sometimes that is when it is strongest of all. And perhaps that is why her stone remains blank. Not because there was nothing to say, but because there was too much. Let us walk, just for a moment, into the twilight of the Tang capital. The lamps are lit along the corridors of Luoyang, casting long golden shadows across the stone floors. Servants move softly through the gardens. The hush of evening prayers echoes from distant temples, and somewhere, perhaps in a room with red curtains drawn tight against the dusk, sits an old woman who once ruled an empire. She is not writing. She is not speaking. She simply watches. Perhaps the folds of her robe are worn thinner than they once were. Perhaps the pins in her hair no longer sparkle with the brilliance of youth. But her mind? It is as precise as ever. She remembers the placement of every gate, the expression of every minister who ever dared to oppose her, the tone of every voice that shook beneath the pressure of her gaze. And yet, there is no one now to look down upon. No more audiences, no more ceremonies, just the sound of birds in the cypress trees and the delicate whistle of wind passing through bamboo. This is her final chapter, and it is quiet. It's hard to say what thoughts occupied her during those days. Did she feel regret? Did she replay the moments of decision, the dismissals, the punishments, the executions? Or did she think of her youth, of the girl who once watched her father transcribe imperial letters, never imagining that one day she herself would write commands that moved armies? Or perhaps she thought of nothing at all. Perhaps, after a life spent calculating every move, she allowed herself, at last, a few moments without strategy. A breath taken not for control, but for its own sake. Those who served her in her final days say she was calm, that she accepted her illness with grace, that she did not rage or weep, that she rested often, her fingers resting on the edge of a scroll, as though she might read again at any moment, as though the work was not quite finished. She had outlived almost everyone who had tried to stop her. Those who plotted in the early years of her reign were long buried. The scholars who protested her elevation had faded from court records. Even some of the temples that resisted her reforms had been rebuilt in her honor, funded by those who once opposed her. She had, in many ways, rewritten not only her role in history, but the roles of everyone around her. Her blank tombstone, still uncarved after her death, remains the most honest testament to her life. Because who could summarize it? Who among the living could condense into a single inscription a journey that stretched across 5 decades of political turbulence, personal transformation, and dynastic reshaping? the scribes declined the task. Or perhaps they feared it. Or perhaps, just perhaps, they knew that silence was the only appropriate tribute to a ruler who had always said more with quiet precision than with declarations. And so, the stone remains blank. Even today, as tourists approach the Chenling mausoleum, many pause before her unmarked stele. They take photos. They whisper. Some laugh, uncomfortably. Some stare longer than they expected to, because something about it lingers. The absence of language forces presence of thought. You cannot skim a blank page. You must reflect. And so we reflect on the woman who ruled as emperor, on the girl who read poetry by candlelight, on the mother who sacrificed her children to save her name, on the nun who returned from the temple, not broken, but sharpened, on the empress who watched the empire bow, not from love, but from necessity. Was she good? History doesn't know. Was she just? Sometimes. Was she powerful? Always. But beyond that, Wu Zetian leaves us with a more complicated inheritance. She asks us to reconsider what power looks like, what it costs, and who is allowed to wield it. She does not ask for sympathy. She never needed it. But perhaps she asks for attention, not to the myths, but to the details, to the way she walked, ruled, listened, endured. And in that attention, we find a kind of rest, a rhythm to drift on, a memory to soften into. So lie back. Let the lanterns dim in your mind. Let the wind carry your thoughts beyond the palace walls. And remember her, not as legend, not as villain, not even as empress, but as a quiet force in the shape of a woman, still standing, still waiting, still Wu. As the reign of Wu Zetian passed into memory, the machinery of the Tang court resumed its steady rotation. New officials were appointed, old rituals re-established, and the emperor's chair once again held the figure of a man. Her son, Zhongzong, now restored, offered public respect for his mother, while carefully distancing himself from her policies. The court, eager to reclaim a sense of normalcy, painted over the traces of her uniqueness with broad strokes of conformity. But not everything could be so easily undone. The ripple effects of her leadership persisted in ways her successors could not fully control. The expanded examination system remained intact. The empire's administrative structure, once bloated and aristocratically entrenched, had been pruned, reformed, made leaner and more efficient. The very concept of power had shifted subtly, no longer just an inheritance of men, but something that could be earned or taken by intellect and will. For a time, officials continued to speak of her cautiously. Her name appeared less in official records, and when it did, it was often laced with subtle rebuke. A paragraph here, a whispered caution there. But even in those criticisms, there was a trace of awe. No matter how they framed her story, they could not shrink her presence. And far beyond the palace walls, her image began to take on a second life. In markets and taverns, storytellers recounted her tale, not as a strict history, but as a living legend. Each retelling shifted slightly. In one version, she was a beautiful girl who outwitted an entire empire. In another, she was a wise empress, betrayed by jealous men. In yet another, she became a kind of sorceress, casting spells with her voice, reading omens in dreams, speaking with dragons in moonlit courtyards. These stories weren't true, but neither were they false. They were reflections of a society trying to understand what it had witnessed, trying to name something that defied its categories. Even centuries later, her image would return in poetry, in paintings, in court debates about the limits of female power. She became a reference point, sometimes a warning, sometimes an aspiration. Her memory could not be boxed in, not by ink, not by silence. And perhaps that was the point all along. Because Wu Zetian did not live to be remembered simply as the first or only. She lived so that the next woman who dared to rule would not need to be called exceptional, just capable. Of course, it would take centuries more before another woman reached anything close to her level of authority. But the door she had opened remained cracked, the air of possibility still seeping through. In one of the few surviving private accounts from the period, a court lady, perhaps one who had served under Wu herself, wrote, "When she spoke, the room grew still. Not because of fear, but because you wished not to miss what she said. Her words arrived like winter light, cold, clear, and rare. And afterward, even silence seemed to carry her voice. It is a rare tribute, not political, not poetic, just human, and perhaps the most accurate of them all. Because for all her grandeur, her policies, her ambition, what made Wu Zetian unforgettable was not merely that she ruled. It was that she ruled with presence, with a gaze that saw past pretense, with decisions that shaped lives beyond her own, with a stillness that contained storms. Now, as the night deepens and sleep draws near, think not just of her as Empress or Emperor, but as a figure standing alone at the edge of history's shore. The tide washes in, trying to erase her footprints, but each wave only carves her shape more clearly into the sand. And so, she stands, as she always did, tall, silent, watching. We've journeyed far with Wu Zetian, through childhood corridors scented with calligraphy ink, into cloisters dim with incense smoke, across throne rooms shimmering with silk and whispered decisions. But before we drift fully into rest, let us sit with one final layer of her life, the quiet psychology of survival. To rule is one thing. To hold power without precedent, without protection, without inherited right, this is something else entirely. And Wu Zetian did not hold power for a season or a span of years. She held it across the arc of her life, through dynasties, through husbands, through sons, and storms, and silences. How? Not through cruelty alone, and not through charm, but through extraordinary self-awareness. She understood her image. She crafted it carefully, allowing others to see what she wanted, rarely more. To emperors, she was humble. To rivals, serene. To allies, exacting. To subjects, distant, but benevolent. She wore roles like robes, adjusting the color and texture for each setting, never losing the body underneath. But there was always risk. Every step forward invited resistance. Every promotion she gave inspired resentment. And yet she pressed on, not recklessly, but with deep emotional calculus. She knew when to withdraw, when to wait, and when to reappear with a gesture so precise it disarmed her enemies without needing to draw blood. This was not coldness. It was strategy born from necessity. Imagine the weight of knowing that a single mistake, not a crime, not a scandal, just a mistake, could unravel it all. That every glance was measured, every word recorded, every silence interpreted. She lived decades inside that pressure, and instead of being crushed by it, she crystallized. She was not only a ruler of land, but of narrative. When Confucian historians warned against her, she commissioned Buddhist texts that praised her virtue. When ministers questioned her past, she reframed it as destiny. When age threatened to erode her command, she painted herself in divine light. No longer just a woman, but a cosmic necessity. And perhaps that's what frightened the establishment most. Not her ambition, not her actions, but her refusal to explain them. She offered no confessions, no justifications, no memoirs. While male rulers filled tombs with proclamations, she left her epitaph stone blank. That absence speaks more loudly than 1,000 carved praises. It says, "Interpret me if you dare," and so we do. Centuries later, we still do. Even now, as you lie in your bed, breath deepening, fingers curled lightly at your side, your mind drifting into the space between story and sleep, Zetian remains with us, not as a ghost, not as a queen, but as a presence. She reminds us that power is not always loud, that influence can be soft, that legacy does not require permission. She reminds us that silence, when held long enough, can become its own kind of language. And in that language, she still speaks. So, if you dream tonight, let it be of red-roofed palaces and mist-covered hills. Let it be of a woman walking slowly through a stone garden, her shadow long against the lantern light. Let it be of a scroll unrolling, word by word, until it reveals not history, but reflection. A story not of triumph or tragedy, but of endurance. Of a voice that once ruled not only an empire, but the space between what was expected and what was possible. In the stillness of the early dawn, when the city of Luoyang still sleeps beneath its haze of incense and frost, there is a softness to the air, like a secret being held just below the breath. The streets that once rang with imperial processions are empty now. The great halls, once echoing with decrees and ceremonial bells, stand in dignified silence. Somewhere beyond the palace, a single bird stirs in a cypress tree, and beneath the earth, behind thick stone, rests the body of a woman who once held the empire in her gaze. She is gone, but her presence lingers. It lingers in the way scribes pause before writing about her, wondering how honest they dare be. It lingers in the way her name is spoken, with a curious mixture of admiration and unease. It lingers in every blank space where a title should be, in every sigh of a historian, unsure whether to praise or condemn. Because Zetian was never meant to be a story. She was meant to be a caution, a contradiction, a challenge. But she became something else, a precedent, and that is far more dangerous than a scandal. She proved that a woman could rule not because a man allowed it, but because she took it. Not because she asked politely, but because she listened, waited, planned, and acted with the precision of a court scribe carving edicts into jade. And yet, she was not only power. She was also the woman who raised children, even as she maneuvered between rival clans. The woman who loved poetry and read sutras by candlelight. The woman who sat beside a dying emperor and eased his final days. The woman who walked alone through palace gardens at twilight, brushing her fingers across the cool leaves of cypress trees that would outlive her. She knew that her time would pass. All emperors do. But she also knew that stories do not need to end when lives do. They echo. They stretch. They wait for someone to listen. And tonight, you have listened. You've walked with her through the shaded corridors of memory, through silken chambers and snow-covered courtyards, through the firelit scrolls of empire. You've heard the footsteps of concubines, the hush of monks in candlelit halls, the soft murmur of imperial secrets passed from hand to hand. And now, as your breath slows and your eyes grow heavier, let her story settle in your mind, not as a warning, not as a monument, but as a soft reminder that every life, no matter how grand or quiet, leaves traces. That even blank stones speak. That even forgotten names remember. So now, as the night deepens and the last pages of this long story close like shutters on a quiet window, let go. Let go of dynasties and titles, of courtiers and scrolls. Let go of palaces and politics, and all the trembling threads that once made an empire. You're no longer in Tang China. You're in your bed, safe, still, breathing. Let the flicker of history fade behind your closed eyelids. Let Zetian, emperor of dust and silk, return to her rest. She has guided you through centuries. Now she bows once more, softly, silently, and turns away into legend. You too may turn now. Turn toward rest, toward peace, toward sleep. Good night, traveler. End of script. Sweet dreams.